Pray. Amen. Faces in the dust. They still speak today. Even though their tongues are mute, they still bear witness to times long past. And they bear testimony. These things we dig up from the dirt. They bear testimony to the things of the Bible and to the stories of the Bible. Many archaeologists and scholars claim that the Bible is full of myths and tales. We should not be surprised that they feel that way, because the Bible itself prophesied that this would happen. This is in 2 Peter 2, 3, and 4. Peter writes this: "Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, 'Where is this coming he promised?' Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." Scoffers, skeptics. I like to use the word biblical minimalist. That means a person who minimizes the value of the Bible. Many people, when they say Bible, they're speaking about a book that is an ancient manuscript, like Homer's Iliad or Shakespeare's plays. And they study the Bible as though they're ancient literature. But when I say the Bible, I believe it is the inspired Word of God. That's my belief. And so when I study the Bible, I believe it's a message for all time. And I believe it is a message especially for me, always has been, always will be. Recently, a magazine that I like to read a lot, I've told some of you about it, Biblical Archaeology Review, had an interesting, very positive biblical article in its pages in the March-April 2014 issue. Now, the authors that are usually published in BAR are not known to be biblical conservatives. As a matter of fact, most of them do everything they can to distance themselves from the Bible. Just don't believe it's truth. They can take it or leave it, and it's based upon their interpretation of the data. And if the data seems to contradict the Bible, they're perfectly happy to leave the Bible behind. And yet here was this very interesting article entitled "Archaeology Confirms 50 Real People in the Bible." And I thought it was a very interesting article, a very good article for as far as it goes. I think there are far more than 50, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. But this author used a very, very high standard to evaluate the information. There had to be 3 pieces of evidence to confirm that this person that was found archaeologically was actually the biblical character. Some of them only have 2, but he requires 3. And so here is this chart. I actually made a copy of this chart for you as a handout. You can have it before you leave tonight. There are these 50 people from various places, and you'll find it interesting to read what he has to say about each one. And at the end of the article, as I copied it for you, I put a website, biblicalarchaeology.org/50. And it gives all of the, what you might call biblical, or rather scholarly references, if you wanted to do a little bit more in-depth research. It seems like every few years that archaeologists find evidence of someone who's mentioned in the Bible. Now, the reason this is so important is because the Bible is under attack by critical scholars and by archaeologists who don't believe its pages. Many of us take for granted that the people in the Bible actually lived. Critical scholars and archaeologists do not take that for granted. Most of the people that I tell you about tonight until we had them confirmed by archaeology, most archaeologists wouldn't even have been willing to admit that they lived. Yet, here we find their faces in the dust. I believe the Bible means what it says and says what it means. I believe that the Israelites, for instance, I believe the Israelites fled Egypt under the leadership of a man named Moses. Moses? Archaeologists would say no evidence that the Israelites ever left Egypt. I believe Moses wrote the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The current scholarly opinion is that those books were written by 4 different authors, and someone came along and incorporated all 4 together. It's called the documentary hypothesis. It's been around since the 1800s, middle 1800s. So you see, you don't understand how the Bible is under attack. I believe that Daniel was actually in a den of lions in Babylon. I believe that God closed the mouths of those lions. I believe that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel in about 600 BC. The critical scholars today say that Daniel probably didn't exist, and that the book of Daniel was written about 200 BC rather than 600 BC. Why? Because they don't believe in prophecy. And in the book of Daniel, it not only lists Babylon, it lists the next kingdom that came after Babylon, which was Medo-Persia. It lists the next kingdom that came after Medo-Persia, which is Greece. And so critical scholars say there's no way Daniel could have named Greece. So therefore, what Daniel actually did was write history and pretend it was prophecy. But he didn't really know it. There's no such thing as prophecy. I could go on and on about the attacks that are against the Bible. This is why I find it a big deal when archaeologists find what I call these faces in the dust. When archaeologists can confirm that someone we know from the Bible actually lived. It's a big deal. It's just one more evidence that the Bible is true and the historicity of its stories. Wait a minute, they have to say. The Bible may be true there. That's why many, many years ago that I became interested in this project that I call Faces in the Dust, and began putting together a chart, just like the one in BAR, only I've been doing it for about 20 years or more. And my chart has about 100 people on it. Now, the reason my chart is a little bit bigger is because some of my criteria is a little looser, but what I do is I grade each find with an A, B, or C. A means absolutely, B means best choice, and C means could be. So I look at these biblical names that we've found through archaeology, and I look at the evidence and I say, oh, absolutely, there's no question this is the person, or this is the best choice. And sometimes it's just could be. One of the other reasons that I have a lot more in my chart is because I also include the New Testament. This gentleman in the BAR article only did Old Testament. And I also include, because I go to the New Testament, I also include the writings of Josephus, who wrote shortly after the time of Jesus. And so I consider him to be quasi-contemporary with the New Testament. And so I also accept his writings. I think another very fascinating area of study would be to find the events and the places of the Bible that are mentioned in the Bible that are also found and confirmed archaeologically. Maybe someone here will take on that task, because I'm only one man. I can only do one. Now, when we do this study of Faces in the Dust, there are 2 types of people that are found. One that I call the secular personages, and then the biblical characters. The secular personages are people like Sargon here. They're usually kings, generals, rulers, or court officials that were associated with the kingdoms that surrounded and interacted with Israel. And so we have them recorded in the Bible because of their interaction with Israel and Judah. But then we also have the biblical characters. And the biblical characters are those we find in the Bible. They're those that are involved in this interaction between God and his people, Israel. Now, there are some difficulties that have to be overcome. How can one know if a name is biblical? If this is really the information that leads to this person that's mentioned? For instance, many years ago, at a place called Tel Dan, which I'm going to tell you more about in just a second, they found an impression on a jar handle with the name Zechariah. If you pick up a good Bible dictionary, it will tell you that there are 32 Zechariahs in the Bible. Must have been a popular name. So there are 32 Zechariahs. Now they say that this handle of the jug dates to about 800 BC. How do they know that? Come Sunday night and I'll tell you how they know that. How do they know? It has to do with pottery dating. They say it dates to about 800 BC. Now, King Zechariah in the Bible is dated, he was king about 800 BC. So this jar handle could be King Zechariah, but there could be others. And so I graded this one a C, could be. The other problem is that names are not always spelled the same in different languages. My name, Frank, would be Francois in French, or Franco in Italian or Spanish. And so in the Bible, you also have names that are Hebrew names that are spelled differently in other Middle Eastern languages. So we have a king named Joachim, have an N at the end. There's also a Jehoiakim with an M, but this is N. You have Jehoiakim. I'll tell you about it a little bit more in just a second. His Hebrew name in Babylonian becomes Joachim. And so there are differences in languages. That's why we need these people who are so bright in linguists, in the study of languages that help us study archaeology also. When you look at the evidence from this biblical text and see how many of the secular world rulers the Bible names, you become convinced that the Bible was written during the time period in which it says it was written, and that it accurately reflects the times of the Bible. And then when you set the stories of God's people against these secular histories, it gives us confidence that these stories are also true. Some archaeologists have quoted the text Luke 19:40. This is when Jesus is at the temple and the children are crying out for him. And Jesus says these words. And someone says to the children, tell them to be quiet. And Jesus says, I tell you, if they kept quiet, the stones would cry out. It seems like today that people who should be standing up for the Bible are not standing up for the Bible, and the stones are crying out. We find these ancient monuments and inscriptions that confirm the Bible to be what it says it is. So, let's look at a number of them in depth. And I'll start off with the first one that was ever found. The first name from the Bible, the first face from the dust ever discovered. In 2 Kings 3:4, it says this. Now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. Moab is a country that is east of Israel across the Jordan River. And at some point in time, Israel had subjugated the Moabites, and Mesha was their king. 2 Kings continues to tell that Ahab died and Jehoram had become the king of Israel, and later on Moab refuses to pay tribute to Israel. And so in 2 Kings 3, we find battles, we find stories about battles between the united monarchy of Israel and the Moabites. And here enters the first evidence of a king from outside the Bible, this man Mesha. Archaeologists in the year 1868, so this is a very old discovery, archaeologists discovered something called the Moabite stone, or it's also called the Mesha stela. It was found in 1868 in a city named Dibon, and when archaeologists found it, it was totally intact. You can see from the picture the darker black areas have been reconstructed, and the lighter areas are the original inscription. But it was originally totally intact. What happened was the government decided that they were going to come in and take it, and the local Bedouin tribesmen said, no, you're not, because they knew it was worth a lot of money. And so there was a dispute over ownership of the Moabite stone. And so what happened was local tribesmen built a big fire around the Moabite stone, threw cold water on it, and it exploded. And then they took these small pieces and scattered them in various areas to antiquities dealers to try to sell and make some money. Well, this is a tragedy. The good news is that before the Moabite stone was broken, someone had made of the Moabite stone something that's called a squeeze. They'd taken paper mache and pushed it into the letters of the Moabite stone and had made a large paper mache cast of the Moabite stone. And so archaeologists were able to find numerous pieces of the Moabite stone, and with the help of the squeeze, they were able to reconstruct it and fill in the missing portions. The inscription reads this: I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab. He existed. The stones cry out. Archaeology has confirmed that this story that we find about Mesha is indeed true. But there's one very, very interesting thing about the version that's on this stone and the version that's in the Bible. On this stone, guess who wins? Mesha wins. According to the biblical version, Mesha doesn't win. Which is an interesting thing. In ancient monuments, the king never lost. In ancient Egyptian monuments, the Egyptian pharaoh never lost a battle. You believe that? No. But they just never recorded it. Sometimes the Egyptian pharaohs just kept winning battles closer and closer to home as they were running home, you understand. So this is a very important find. And so we have on here Mesha, but it also has some other names on here, because Mesha is fighting against people in Israel. We also have the name of Omri, who was a king of Israel, and we also have the name of Ahab, the son of Omri. So not only do we have a pagan foreign king, but we have two of the biblical kings who are mentioned, Omri and Ahab. Very significant. 3 names for the price of one. Omri we see on other Assyrian monuments, by the way, and Ahab we're going to see on another one right here. I'm sorry, Omri we'll see on another one right here. This is something that's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser is in the British Museum. It is a legend in my household. We were, my 2 children and my wife and I are playing Bible trivia one day for children. And the Bible trivia question asked the question, where is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser? And I said, well, it's in the British Museum. They turned the card over, British Museum. My wife's like, who would have ever asked a bunch of kids this question? So, the black obelisk of Shalmaneser is a joke in my house. But I've seen the black obelisk of Shalmaneser 3 times at the British Museum. It's a fascinating, large monument. It's called a stela. It tells about an Assyrian king whose name was Shalmaneser. There were 5 of them, by the way, Shalmanesers. This is Shalmaneser III. And it tells about his exploits and conquests in war. And on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser is a very interesting picture of a man bowing down. You see him kneeling before a king. And underneath, if you could read the cuneiform text, it says, Jehu, son of Omri. This is an Israelite king who was the son of Omri. We just talked about Omri. So here we have another king, Jehu. Jehu is famous for being a hard driver of chariots. Some of you might remember that. He's driving like Jehu. That's kind of the way I drive too. But we have Jehu on this. He's kneeling and giving tribute. And he has a number of, on another tier of the obelisk, there are some other people who look like Israelites who are carrying tribute to King Shalmaneser. Now this is also a very significant find. So we have another king. Jehu and Omri is again confirmed. By the way, there is in the Bible, I have to warn you this, there is in the Bible a king named Shalmaneser who's mentioned by name, but this is not the same one. This is the 3rd, and that's the 5th. So we don't have this Shalmaneser's name in the Bible. Here's another example, 2 Kings 18:13. It says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Archaeologists in Mesopotamia have actually found the palace of Sennacherib. They've actually found his throne room, incredible, beautiful reliefs such as you see here. And this is a picture of Sennacherib on his throne. He came to Judah and attacked cities. And so we have in the Bible Sennacherib. We know of Sennacherib from other sources now, so we have him confirmed. In 2 Chronicles 39, verse 2, it tells us that he laid siege to a place called Lachish. And here is on his palace walls, here are pictures of his siege at Lachish. So these are bona fide. So this is one of those times not only do you get a name, you get a place. And archaeologists have actually dug through this destruction level at Lachish. I've been to Lachish. A very fascinating place to visit. And on his walls of his monument or of his throne room, you see these fascinating pictures. Here's a battering ram that they used at the Battle of Lachish. Anyone they caught, they would impale. You have these on the walls. Archers, slingers. It's quite an event. And Sennacherib does defeat Lachish, and after defeating Lachish, he goes on to Jerusalem. He does not defeat Jerusalem, but he puts his army in a circle around Jerusalem. It's called siege battle. He puts them under siege. No one can get in, no one can get out. And during this time, Sennacherib has a prism It's called a prism from its shape, a cuneiform prism written about his siege at Jerusalem. And it's very fascinating. He claims in this prism, and by the way, this is called the Taylor prism. This inscription is known from at least 8 different sources. So he did it. He wanted to brag so much about this that he did it on many sources. But he writes in this inscription, He writes about making Hezekiah a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. He says, I surrounded him with earthworks in order to molest those who were leaving the city gate. So Hezekiah is another king of Jerusalem, of Judah. And here Sennacherib brags about caging him up like a bird in a cage. Sennacherib did not conquer Jerusalem, but Jerusalem paid tribute, and then Sennacherib was off to another hotspot. And so here you have a confirmation of 2 more names. Hezekiah is also known because of this interesting seal, a seal impression, and I'll tell you more about that in just a second. And this seal impression says Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, his father. And so not only do we have Hezekiah confirmed, now we also have his father confirmed. And Hezekiah is also famous for any of you who might have been to Jerusalem. There is this fascinating tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel. Hezekiah had it dug so he could bring the water from the Gihon spring, which is here, into the city of Jerusalem. And so he dug this large tunnel, long tunnel. It is 1/4 of a mile long. It's very fascinating because it goes like this. And they started digging from both ends and ended up in the middle. It's a very fascinating story. Have some of you walked through Hezekiah's Tunnel? A couple of you have, I think. Yeah, I knew, Charles, I thought you had. It's a very fascinating place to go. And then it goes from the Gihon spring and ends up in the Pool of Siloam. And the Pool of Siloam is famous because of the story of Jesus. When he heals the blind man, he tells him to go wash in the Pool of Siloam. And he's healed. So Hezekiah is also another well-known biblical character. The next one I want to tell you about is Nebuchadnezzar. Probably all of you have heard of Nebuchadnezzar. It's basically the whole book of Daniel. 2 Kings 24:10 through 12 says this. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, I used his name just a little while ago. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner. So the whole book of Daniel is about what Nebuchadnezzar did, taking these people to Babylon. He took the king at that point in time, Jehoiakim, all of his family. He took Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but I like to use their Hebrew names. He took them at this point in time. And the whole book of Daniel is about being in Babylon. Now, we know a lot about Nebuchadnezzar from this huge treasure trove of tablets that archaeologists have found and deciphered. There are so many tablets about the reign of Nebuchadnezzar that they actually call them the Babylonian Chronicles. There's so much information about Nebuchadnezzar. And plus, we know Nebuchadnezzar because when he built the city of Babylon, he had his name impressed on thousands of bricks in the city of Babylon. So here you see one of the bricks in which the city of Babylon was built. They're large bricks, And some of you have seen in my personal collection this small fragment of a brick that I own. None of you have seen the full inscription that I just recently bought. This is my it's not the newest acquisition, but the newest great acquisition. And this is the whole inscription. They cut the margin of the brick off to make it easier to ship. But this is the whole inscription. It's up here on the table in the front if you'd like to see what the inscription looks like before we leave tonight. I was so thrilled when I got this. I mean, I was so thrilled. You can't believe how thrilled I was. When I got it, I didn't even show it to my wife because I knew she wouldn't care. We also know from Nebuchadnezzar, from that scripture that we read, that Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim, the king, as a captive. It's fascinating that archaeologists digging in the area of the Ishtar Gate found this very tablet. And on this tablet is the name Joachim, king of Judah. So not only does the Bible tell us that Jehoiakim was taken to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar himself tells us that Jehoiakim was in Babylon, and this tablet actually reveals the rations or the foodstuffs that was given to Jehoiakim when he was captive there in Babylon. Not only has the name been fulfilled, the title, it's a confirmation of the biblical text. And then just one more about Babylon. You all probably know about this guy who's the last king of Babylon, Belshazzar, and he's the handwriting on the wall guy. Well, the Bible tells us that Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. Now, archaeologists said, no, that's not true. He was not the last king of Babylon. Cuneiform records say that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. There's no evidence of him having a son or of a king named Belshazzar ever. And so the archaeologists said the Bible is wrong. By the way, Nabonidus is not mentioned in the Bible, but Belshazzar. Well, archaeologists found this cylinder, cuneiform cylinder, in which it's a prayer of Nabonidus, and he's praying for, quotes, Belshazzar, the firstborn son, the offspring of my heart. So Belshazzar has been confirmed. He actually existed, as the Bible says. And then, later on, archaeologists found another tablet, and this is the tablet. It's called the Nabonidus Chronicles, and it says that Nabonidus was in Tema, and his son Belshazzar was in Babylon. So it looks like Nabonidus and Belshazzar were co-rulers, and probably at the time when Babylon was destroyed, the night of the handwriting on the wall, probably Nabonidus was off at the summer home and Belshazzar was on duty, and that's the night Babylon fell. You know, if Daniel had been written 400 years later than this, none of these details could be so exact. But this is proof that the Bible indeed is right. It's reflecting the times accurately. Now, there's one last person in this whole flow of events I've taken you through so far. And this is in Isaiah 45:1. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. It was foretold in Isaiah that a man would come whose name was Cyrus, and he would be a conqueror or deliverer. Notice the word that's used for him, anointed. My anointed Cyrus. The word in Hebrew is Messiah, Messiah. And so Cyrus was somebody special to God. Why? Because God was going to use Cyrus to deliver his people. Because Cyrus is the one who conquered Babylon. It's a fascinating story. If you might remember, while Belshazzar was having a feast and having all the fun and drinking and all those things, while he was having the party, Cyrus diverted the river, marched under the gates, and took Babylon the night of the party. And so Cyrus conquered Babylon and ultimately was responsible for Israel being able to go back to Jerusalem. And here on this cylinder, it's called the Cyrus cylinder, the battle or the capture of Babylon is recorded on this item. It's a very fascinating object when you read it. I don't read it like that, but I've read the translation. It talks about how Marduk, who is the king of the Babylonians, had seen that things were going bad in Babylon. And so Marduk had chosen him, Cyrus, to come in and deliver them. And so he was not claiming to come in as a conqueror. He was coming in as a deliverer. We actually also know where the tomb of Cyrus is. It's not a very impressive tomb, is it? But this is the tomb of, we call him Cyrus the Great. Now, let me tell you we've been looking at a bunch of cuneiform inscriptions. But let me tell you about a different kind of item that has been used to confirm biblical people. Here's Jeremiah 36, verse 4. It says, "So Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on the scroll." So who is Baruch? Baruch is the scribe of Jeremiah. And what would happen oftentimes when a scribe would write something down, they would make a sealing on a document or a scroll. And so we have these interesting ancient items. They're called bulla. The singular is called bulla, and B-U-L-L-A-E is the plural. They're sealings from documents. After something was written, they would put a piece of mud on it, or back in the 80s, when my wife used to write me love letters, she would drip wax on it. Some of you women will remember that. Drip wax on it and put a seal in it, something like that. It's the same principle, only it was usually done in clay. And so we have all these ancient sealings, and they would be used for sealing a document like this. Well, archaeologists many years ago found a group of bullae in Jerusalem, and as they read these bullae, they discovered on one of those bullae, can you read it? It says, Baruch, son of Neriah. Here is an actual sealing from the seal of Baruch, a biblical character, with Jeremiah. And what's even more fascinating is they didn't only find this one, but a few years later, they found this one. And you can't see it very well, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, can you see the texture looks just a little bit wavy? It's a fingerprint. And one has to wonder, if not only do we have the name of Baruch, do we actually have his fingerprint? It's a very fascinating object. Another ancient bullae seal that was found at a place where I personally dug, at Tel El Umiri. Jeremiah 40:14 says, "Don't you know that Baalis, king of the Ammonites, has sent Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, to take your life? But Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, did not believe them." This talks about Baalis, the king of the Ammonites. There was a seal found at Tel El Umiri, which is part of the Madba Plains project in Jordan, where I dug back in 2002. And about 6 years before I was on the dig, the archaeologists had found there a seal, and they found it in excavation. And on the weekend, everyone generally goes out and tours, but the head of the dig was a guy named Larry Herr. And Larry decided that he was not going to go out for the tour over the weekend. He was going to stay and study this seal. And it's not easy to read, but you can see this is a drawing of it. But as he studied it, he says he sees that it says Milcom, servant of Baalis. So this is not really the seal of Baalis, it's the seal of one of his servants. But it has the name Baalis on it. When I've heard Larry tell this story about how when he discovered this, he was just like dancing around. But there was nobody there to tell. And they didn't have cell phones quite as much back then. And so, he had to wait until everybody got back to tell of his incredible find. One of the most spectacular, I think, was found in 1993. It has to do with King David. 2 Samuel 5, verse 3. It says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. Now, we all take it for granted. We've heard about King David. We've studied about King David. We take it for granted that he was a real character. But until 1993, King David was considered to be as reliable a historical figure as King Arthur, a real mythical figure. But in 1993, an archaeologist named Avraham Biran was excavating in a place called Tel Dan. Tel Dan is the very tippy northern part of Israel, 30 miles above the Sea of Galilee. And they were excavating in a large plaza area. They know for sure that this is the Tel Dan of the Bible because they found this signpost, in essence, that says this is Tel Dan, or this is Dan. And they were excavating in this large plaza. And as they were excavating, they came upon a wall that had been built. And can you see this stone right here? It was a stone that was built into the wall in what we call secondary use. When they built the wall, they just took any refuse that was lying around and built it into a wall. And as they pulled it out, they could see this large inscription on it. And they began to look at it and decipher it. Now, by the way, this is only a fragment of a very large inscription. It's called a stela. I used that word a little while ago. Usually a round-topped, large inscription. But this is just a portion of it. But the most important portion was preserved. Because on this stela, it speaks about a king who came down and attacked Israel. And it says, defeated a king from the house of David. Now, David is not only confirmed. Now, he didn't attack David, you understand. He attacked one of David's descendants, a king from the house of David. And so not only is David confirmed, but so is his Davidic line, these rulers that ruled after him from the house of David. It's a very significant archaeological find. This was such an earth-shattering find that archaeologists actually accused Avraham Biran of salting the dig, of planting this inscription. That's how desperate they got. Later on, they found another piece of it, and so you have it connected here. As they continue to dig at Tel Dan, I'm hoping that they will find more of it. Who knows? I just had the opportunity to see this piece. It was at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Candace took me to the Metropolitan Museum for my birthday in December. We spent a few days in New York, and I was able to see it, and I was really pretty excited. She didn't go in there with me, but I found it interesting. that I was so excited looking at it, and there were several dozen people in this gallery, not one of them looking at it, but they didn't know what it was. A very significant artifact. Now, within the last year, I told you earlier about the Moabite stone. Within the last year, an archaeologist has claimed that he found, and he's a very, very well-respected archaeologist, claims that he has found the name David, the house of David, on the Moabite stone. He has to reconstruct one letter because of where it was broken, I told you. He has to reconstruct one letter, but he says it's the only letter that makes sense. And so within the last year, it seems that David has also been confirmed on the Moabite stone. Well, let me tell you about an Egyptian. 1 Kings 14, 25 and 26. In the 15th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. Now, archaeologists say that this pharaoh that the Bible calls Shishak is a biblical, or is a Egyptian pharaoh whose name was Shishak the first. Now, notice what it says he did. He took the 200 golden shields that Solomon had made. Those golden shields weighed 15 pounds each. So 15 pounds of solid gold would be $56 million of gold at today's prices. This is a lot of gold. Now, that's 3,000 pounds of gold. Now, the Egyptians had this way of boosting their economy. It was called thievery. It was called beat up on whoever you can and steal what they've got. And so every year, the Egyptian army would go out into the countryside, up and around, and into Israel, over into Africa, over into Mesopotamia. Every year, they would march out and steal stuff from everybody and bring it home, and it was really good for the economy. But maybe not so great for the people who they were conquering and pillaging, right? So we have this pharaoh whose name was Shishak the first. He was a very, very powerful conqueror. And we have his name in the Bible. It's a very fascinating confirmation of him having lived. On the walls of the Karnak temple, which is down by the Valley of the Kings, we have many pictures of him. Here's an interesting picture of him in a classic pose. We call this the smiting pose. He's holding some guys up. Of course, they're smaller than him, of course. Holding some guys up by their hair, and he's got his hand raised. And in his hand, he's got what's called a mace, and he's getting ready to do that to them. In 926 BC, when the Bible talks about Shishak coming up into Judah, on the walls of the temple at Karnak, he carves all of these little faces in the dust, and they all are, well, you can see a better picture here. See, they're captives. They've got their arms tied behind them. And he talks about 46 Bible cities from Judah and Israel that he conquered. Jerusalem is not mentioned, but he does mention the kingdom of Judah. And so Shishak is an Egyptian king who's been found in archaeological sources. But what I find really fascinating is that he had a grandson who was called Shishak the second, who is his grandson. His son was named, I don't have my notes here, but I'm having a mental block. But his grandson is Shishak the second. When they have found the grave of Shishak the second, not of the first or his father, but they found the grave of Shishak the second, and they found it was lush with burial goods. The casket on the right-hand side is a full casket in the form of a hawk. It's a full-size body casket. It's made from silver. And for us, gold is more valuable than silver. Actually, in ancient Egypt, silver was more valuable than gold. It was rarer than gold. So this is a very, very exquisite, expensive burial. But notice on the left-hand side of the screen, you have this beautiful burial mask of Shishonk II, made of pure gold. One has to wonder if this could have been the gold that was stolen from Israel, that grandson inherited. Or maybe grandfather used it all on his burial. Who knows? But now you know why the Egyptians had so much gold. It's not that they mined it all. They stole a lot of it. Well, let me show you, just in the last few minutes here, a few New Testament examples. Luke 3:1. It says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, and it continues on. It talks about Pontius Pilate. Now, for many years, Pontius Pilate had not been confirmed from secular resources, only from the Bible and only from Josephus. And most critical scholars don't really like Josephus. They think he was not always accurate, and he probably wasn't. But most critical scholars don't like Josephus. One Roman writer named Tacitus had spoken of him, but they discounted him because they thought that he'd gotten his information from the Christians. And so it was that they were excavating at this beautiful theater in Caesarea. Caesarea is the city that was built by Herod the Great. It sits overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, this would have been such a beautiful setting for a theater. I've been in this theater a couple times, just sitting and looking out and feeling the breezes coming in off the Mediterranean Sea. It's a very, very pleasant feeling. Well, they were excavating this theater at Caesarea. They came upon a landing stone that they moved, and the landing stone, as they could see it, as I say a landing, I mean like on a staircase, a landing on the staircase, it was just smooth on one side, but when they removed it, they found it was covered with writing. And the inscription said this: Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, gave the Caesareans the Tiberium, or the temple of Tiberius. You can actually read right here, P, do you see the P? I-L-A-T-U-S. Pontius Pilate. Not only was his name confirmed, but also was his role, the prefect of Judea. And I should have let you read it on here. Can you read it better on here? See the P? Pilate. Another example from the New Testament is from Matthew 26:3. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the place of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest when Jesus was crucified. Christians kind of hate his name. Josephus tells us that his personal name, Caiaphas, was a family name. His personal name was Joseph. In the late 70s, archaeologists were doing some construction work outside Jerusalem, and they came upon a typical first century burial cave. A first century burial cave usually has an abundance of these items, which are called ossuaries, or bone boxes. The typical form of burial at that point in time was you laid someone out on a slab, and then when their body deteriorated to the point where you could disassemble their body, you would take the bones, break the ligaments, and put them in these boxes. And so these are bone boxes. Yeah, it's kind of strange. But this was the custom of the day. There are thousands of these bone boxes. Well, they found this beautifully decorated one. It's kind of reminds you of Jesus' words, that they whitewash the tombs, but inside are full of dead men's bones. These are beautifully decorated limestone boxes, but inside are full of dead men's bones. And one of these boxes, this one itself, beautifully decorated, on the end has a name scratched in. And the name is actually found on two boxes, but on this particular box, it says Joseph, son of Caiaphas. It's possible that this bone box, with its bones in it, the actual bones of the man who was the high priest who had Jesus killed. A very fascinating find. Possibly the very man. Well, I wish I had lots of time to tell you more, because there are so many other fascinating artifacts. Here's this beautiful seal of Hoshea, the last king of Israel. Just lovely. Here's a seal of Jeroboam, the king of Israel. Here's a signet ring with the name Jotham on it, who was also a king of Judah. I'd love to take the time to tell you about Sargon, king of Assyria, who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and destroyed it. He ended the northern kingdom of Israel. And all about his palace with these fascinating, beautiful royal sculptures. One of my favorites is a guy named Ashurbanipal. On Ashurbanipal's palace, he's mentioned in the Bible. On Ashurbanipal's palace, they have these beautiful reliefs carved of the lion hunt. And they have Ashurbanipal out hunting lions. It's a very fascinating story. And they also found in his palace a royal library of cuneiform tablets. Fascinating find. I wish I had time to tell you more about Uzziah, who was a leper king of Judah. And they found this inscription that says, here were brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, do not open. Interesting. He was a leper. And then here's this beautiful seal. It has the name Jezebel on it. It dates to the right time period of the Jezebel we know in the Bible. But archaeologists are still cautious. I give this one a B. It's not absolute, but it's pretty good. Plus, it's a royal-looking seal. It's not just an average seal. It's a royal-looking seal. One last thing I have to tell you about that some of you might have heard about was a very controversial find. It's been called by some the Jesus ossuary. In actual fact, it's not the Jesus ossuary. In actual fact, it's the James ossuary. But on this bone box, it says, James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. Now, this is such a controversial find. It was found in the collection, it was first made known from the collection of a collector in Israel whose name was Golan. And he has been accused of forging this inscription. He actually went to trial. It was like a 4-year trial in which he was tried with forging this inscription, but he was never convicted. He was found not guilty. It's a very fascinating box. Does it say James, the son of Joseph? Most archaeologists agree it does. Does it say the brother of Jesus? That's where they're not sure. Some think that someone put on the brother of Jesus to make it more valuable, so to speak. Who knows? It seems like, is it authentic? It seems like it depends on the attitude of the evaluator. Those who want it to be authentic seem to think it's authentic. Those who don't really want it to be don't think it's authentic. The Jewish authorities are convinced it's a forgery. The Jewish authorities have no interest in finding a Jesus artifact, let me tell you the truth. So, is it or is it not? Who knows? It's interesting to think about. Well, over and over again, as I've shown you tonight, the faces from the dust have shone light on the Bible, confirming the accuracy of its stories. Over and over again, the light of the Scriptures shines on our path, revealing to us today how God would have us walk. I've shown you from archaeological evidence that David was a real, living, breathing person. But really what's most important is not that information for us tonight. The real question is, what will you do about that? Here are his words, the words of David. Psalm 119, 105. Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. Psalm 119, 11. I've hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. I can show you over and over again how the Bible has been confirmed to be historically accurate. But the question is, what are you going to do with the Bible in your life? It is not just an ancient book, but Paul says it is the power of God for your salvation. So, what will you do about it? Let's just close this part with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for the opportunity tonight to look into your word and to see how it's been confirmed over and over and over again. But I pray, Lord, that with this knowledge in our brains and hearts tonight, that you will just draw us to be willing to study it more, to be willing to think more about how we can bring our lives into order with the Bible, and to learn how you would have us to walk and live our lives because of the Bible. In Jesus' name I